All right, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies while I'm getting settled. I'm pasting in the biographies of our speakers here today, which is incredibly important to me because I always want them to be recognized. Welcome here today to our 2024 Fair Housing Boot Camp. For those of you who are new to our sessions, welcome. For those of you who have already joined us in these sessions, welcome back. Today, we are going to be discussing fair housing rights in the context of LGBTQ plus community and the rights of those folks. So brief recap of what we've gone through in the past. We've already had a few sessions on our fair housing basics, our fair housing for folks experiencing disabilities, and also for our immigrant population. Now we're moving into this conversation, and I am very happy that you are all here with us today, and I'm always very honored to be in community learning with you. We have with us again today Joe Cordova and Pia Molina, who I've said before and I'll say again, I'm very happy to be sharing this platform with as colleagues of mine at FLS, but also as people who are incredibly passionate about the work that they do and incredibly passionate about this law. So housekeeping announcements before we get into the good stuff. This is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent to you all who are here and all who are registered. Closed captions are enabled for you. If you're having any issue onboarding those, I'm going to drop my email into the chat. You can email me or just message me separately and I will assist you. CLE credit. Although this is part of a wider training series, each part of the training series is accredited with its own CLE code. I will announce that code at the end of today's session. I will also type it in the chat, and you will also get a copy of that CLE information along with the recording that you will receive within 24 hours of the event. So the final piece of housekeeping announcement, my favorite, questions and answers. Don't be shy. This has been so awesome being in community with you all throughout these conversations. It's incredible to hear your questions, your experiences, your thoughts, and we welcome them. So please drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. Joe does an amazing job at filtering those while he's talking. I don't know how he reads it and talks and answers everything simultaneously. He is amazing. So please feel free to drop them in and they will be answered as we proceed. And so without further ado, just a reminder that the bios of our speakers are in the chat because at this point, this is about our third or fourth session, so you can check it out there. Without further ado, Joe, Pia, thank you again for doing this. Thank you for opening the floor to this important conversation. And we look forward to learning from you today.
Thank you so much for having us again, Alexis. And I don't know how to do a Zoom round of applause, but honestly, the behind the scenes work for Alexis is fantastic. So thank you so much for all that you do for us, because all Pia and I have to do is show up and deliver the presentation. You do everything else. So thank you so much for that. And then a quick note to all of our participants. So this is our fourth session. Just remember the first 5-10-ish minutes, we do a little recap. We've encouraged Pia to not be shy with the recap, because looking at the participant list, I think, close to maybe half of you have already been a part of our presentation, but half of you, this is your first session. So we just want to make sure that that recap is as in-depth as it needs to be for people who are actually hearing this stuff for the first time. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to Pia, and thank you guys for being here.
Hi, everyone. As they said, my name is Pia Molina, and I'll be doing kind of the beginning portion. Today, we're talking specifically about LGBTQ community and how it applies to fair housing rights. So why is this important? I feel like these statistics have numbers from a while ago, but I would say they're more aggravated, more important now down the line. But in 2013, a study showed that a study by the Department of Housing and Urban Development showed that same-sex couples experience significant levels of discrimination when responding to rental housing in metropolitan areas nationwide. Heterosexual couples were favored over same-sex couples by 16%. In 2015, a U.S. transgender survey, nearly one quarter of transgender people reported housing discrimination because of their gender identity, and 1 in 5 transgender people in the United States has been discriminated when seeking a home. More than 1 in 10 have been evicted from their homes because of their gender identity. And so I think we'll kind of go into where this falls into the basics, but no, you can go ahead, Joe. So these are just some things that, might not sound discriminatory or might sound benign, but definitely have inclinations to be breaking the Fair Housing Act. So sorry, we don't rent a family like yours. This apartment isn't going to work for people like you. Sorry, only quote unquote normal couples can live here. This neighborhood probably isn't the right fit for you, or now just isn't a good time to be renting to people like you.
And I just want to jump in real quick. That last one, now just isn't a good time to be renting to people like you. That's one I've heard more than a few times, especially in the last couple of years, as the Florida political climate is really kind of tightening the screws on LGBTQ community in schools and housing. Like we talked last week when we talked about the Florida's immigration law. When the Florida passed the Don't Say Gay bill that took out any references to LGBTQ community in schools, it's another example of empowering people to be discriminatory towards the LGBTQ community. So I have heard people say, the landlords seemed nice, they seemed fine, but then they said now is just not a good time to get into the whole thing. That's why we have laws, because the whole thing is people's livelihoods. So yeah, that's one we hear, definitely.
And so, yeah, so this may be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. I think it's important to keep in mind that discrimination might not always be extremely overt, and it might not always come in the form of explicitly saying something, but even those statements kind of imply that there's something going on there. Yeah, you can go ahead. And so what we're talking about today is the Federal Fair Housing Act. Federal is emphasized in this case because we're talking about something that is nationwide. Each locality might have more protections. As you'll see today, LGBTQ rights are not explicit in the act, or they're not written out as a protected class explicitly, but they are enforced that way. And Joe's going to get more into how that happens. But it applies to all over the country. And here, where I am in Gainesville, there are explicit protections in Alachua County and in the City of Gainesville Fair Housing Act that protect sex discrimination. So it's important to see, where you're at. But even federally, at least the way it's enforced now, it still applies to LGBTQ rights. And it is, prohibits discrimination in housing-related transactions. And these are the 7 protected classes: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, and that is where the LGBTQ rights will fall under, disability, or familial status. And the Act has 2 different protections. One is disparate treatment. So when a policy is discriminatory on its face, so it is treating people differently based on one of these protected classes or using one of these protected classes against you when it comes to housing. And then disparate impact, which is a policy that is not discriminatory, so it applies to everyone, but it results negatively on one protected class more than another. And so to go further into the protected classes, so race in the Act is defined as your heritage, bloodline, identity, where your family comes from, and is different or is differentiated from color, where color is defined as the literal color of your skin and features. Disability, we had a presentation about that earlier, but it's a whole part of the Act, a whole different part of the Act, and it is a major disability, both physical and mental, that disrupts a major life activity. And a major life activity is defined as, walking, talking, breathing. Most things will fall under a major life activity. Sex, this includes both, sexual harassment, things like quid pro quo and hostile environment, and gender identity and sexual orientation. It is enforced to include both. National origin, that's where you or your family might be from. This includes speaking a different language, where, when you're in the presence of someone who might rent you a home, that is also protected. Religion, it includes any religion you might practice, or if you don't practice a religion, both are considered protected. And families with children is anyone living with minors under the age of 18. So this includes pregnant people and anyone seeking custody, grandparents or foster parents. And all of these are both identities that you might identify as, and the perception of these identities as well. So if someone thinks you're something and that's the reason they're denying you housing, that also counts as a protected class, even if you yourself might not identify that way. And it's not a minority status thing either. Everyone has these identities. Everyone can have these identities used against them. So it's not for a specific minority. Although we'll be talking about something like that today.
All right. So the bulk of what we're talking about today is how did gender identity and sexual orientation come to be enforced under the Fair Housing Act, and what does that actually mean for the present day and the future? So in the 2020, summer of 2020, the Supreme Court delivered their opinion on the case Bostock v. Clayton County. This was a case that was originated, I believe, in Georgia, Clayton County, Georgia. It was based on an employment-based discrimination. An employee of the county had worked there for over a decade, close to 20 years, impeccable record as an employee, and in his spare time joined a softball league that recruited primarily LGBTQ community members to be a part of this softball league. He was terminated from his employment, saying it was unbecoming of a county employee to participate in such an activity. Filed a lawsuit at the trial level, the district court levels. It was just turned away. They didn't even make it to trial and stuff like that. It was simply turned away. It was taken to the higher courts. It bounced around for about 10 years, about 7 years, 9 years, something like that. By the time it made its way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the U.S. Supreme Court analyzed this case under what protections are encompassed under Title VII, discrimination on the basis of sex. So again, this was an employment-based discrimination case. And the court determined that sex-based discrimination encompasses gender identity and sexual orientation. Some very important concepts that to pull out of the majority opinion from Bostock v. Clayton County is that sexual orientation-based discrimination is gender-based discrimination. If an employer allows a female employee to love and be in a relationship with a male partner, but disallows a male employee to do the same thing, this is gender-based discrimination. This is different terms and conditions based on the gender of the employee. I'm letting my female employee do something that I'm not allowing my male employee to do. They both want to do the exact same thing, have a loving relationship with a male partner. One is allowed, the other is not. That is sex-based discrimination. That is as bare bones, basic legal reasoning as you can get. It took us all the way till 2020 to get it, but we did it. And majority opinion was written by a Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, a Trump appointee, and it was a majority opinion 6-3. I believe the dissenters were Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh. And so the 6-3 decision coming in 2020 with the bare bones basic legal reasoning was not only a victory for LGBTQ community, but I think it's a victory for kind of plain language legal opinions, because it's such a general concept that you don't really have to read into it to try to understand it and see if it applies at this place or somewhere else. Some important quotes that comes out of that case. An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids. And also, we agree that homosexuality and transgender status are distinct concepts from sex. But as we've seen, discrimination based on homosexuality or transgender status necessarily entails discrimination based on sex. The first cannot happen without the second. So what this opinion is doing is that it's saying, while yes, sexual orientation and gender identity are separate from sex or gender, you can't have discrimination of one without discriminating against the other. So discrimination against discrimination against sexual orientation will always be discrimination based on sex. So As far as case law is concerned, the impact on Bostock or from Bostock was huge. Okay, I just checked the numbers this morning. As of this morning on Westlaw, it has 1,153 citing references to Bostock, and that's just cases. So in 4 years, over 1,000 cases have referenced Bostock. Okay. Some of those do have negative treatment, and some of that negative treatment is really carving out spaces for religious-based exemptions. And then one thing to keep in mind, while we all know that, the Supreme Court of the United States is the law of the land, what they say goes everywhere. But we still have 29 states that do not have sexual orientation and gender identity protections that mirror what the Supreme Court said. Now, we all know, hey, shrug our shoulders, that might not matter, because the Supreme Court said that you have this protection. But if you still have 29 states that have not codified this into their laws, you're still going to have to go through state courts and state arguments. You're still going to have to file cases. That's probably why there's over 1,000 cases citing to Bostock, because at the state level, there are still some hurdles that you have to get over before you can get to this, federal determination of the Supreme Court. So a little bit of negative treatment and some pushback, but for the most part, Bostock's impact has opened doors for LGBTQ community. What it really did was it implemented itself into the department rules and the enforcement of existing laws via memos and policies. And I'll walk you through that right now. Real quick. Oh, I had a, okay. In Bostock v. Clayton County, the Supreme Court held that Title VII's prohibition on discrimination because of sex covers discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So the Biden administration in 2021 put forth Executive Order 13988. In fact, it did this in January, I believe it was January 21st, 2021. Let's keep in mind those dates. This Supreme Court case was decided in June of 2020. It was 7 months later that the executive order came from the executive branch of our government. Why is that? Because we had a new president in January 21. Okay, so the existing administration sat on that legal reasoning and did nothing with it. Once Biden moved into that spot, it was really only just a week later, or honestly, do the math, it's just a couple days later, and we have Executive Order 13988, which basically says, under Bostock's reasoning, any law that prohibits sex discrimination, including Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, the Fair Housing Act, which is what we're talking about today, and Section 412 of the Immigration Nationality Act, along with their respective implementing regulations, now prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, so long as the laws do not contain sufficient indications to the contrary. So the Biden administration basically took this legal reasoning and said, any law that we are tasked with enforcing that has a sex-based discrimination protection component, we will now be enforcing sexual orientation and gender identity underneath the enforcement and the guise of that law. And so 13988 Executive Order, Section 2, enforcing prohibitions on sex discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. It was to first review and enforce all policies to prevent sex discrimination as it pertains to the Bostock ruling. And then it has to be sprinkled throughout all the agencies of the federal government that are tasked with enforcing these laws. So HUD, one of those departments that's tasked with enforcing the Fair Housing Act, received orders through Executive Order 13988 and said, okay, well, we have a law that protects discrimination against sex, which means we are now supposed to include sexual orientation and gender identity in those protections. So after 13988, the FHEO, which is the Fair Housing Enforcement Office of HUD, put out a notice effective immediately. FHEO shall accept for filing and investigate all complaints of sex discrimination, including discrimination because of gender identity or sexual orientation that meet other jurisdictional requirements. And then soon after, The acting, I think it was at the time, it was the interim deputy secretary of HUD, Jeannie Warden, put out a memo on February 11th, 2021. This memorandum also affects state and local agencies that enter into agreements with the department under the Fair Housing Assistance Program, FAPS, pursuant to which such agencies process discrimination complaints under laws that the department certifies as substantially equivalent to the Fair Housing Act. So this is a little bit of a callback to that bullet point we had earlier, where 29 states still have not enumerated sexual orientation and gender identity-based protections underneath their laws that have sex-based discrimination protections, which include state fair housing laws. This Warden memo said, however, if you are a state agency that is receiving federal dollars to implement and enforce the Fair Housing Act, such as a Fair Housing Assistance Program, you are to include sexual orientation and gender identity in your enforcement. So here in the state of Florida, the Florida Fair Housing Act does not say sexual orientation and gender identity is a protected class or is protected under sex-based discrimination. But if you file a claim with the Florida Commission on Human Relations or any regional FAP in the state of Florida, they are recognized as what's called a substantially equivalent agency as Fair Housing Act enforcers, and therefore they will in fact enforce and take those claims of sexual orientation and gender identity-based discrimination. So you can kind of see how the path or the map works all the way from that Supreme Court case all the way to local enforcements. Also in that memo, similarly, organizations and agencies that receive grants through HUD's Fair Housing Initiative Program, FIPS, such as Florida Legal Services, and carrying out activities under these grant agreements must interpret sex discrimination under the Fair Housing Act to include discrimination because of sexual orientation and gender identity. What does that mean? That means that if you are a FIP organization such as ourselves, when you go out and about into the community and do education and outreach, you are going to educate and outreach on behalf of LGBTQ protections, such as a Tuesday at noon presentation that covers exactly what we're talking about. We are a FIP, and that is exactly what we're doing in this moment. So if you're receiving federal dollars to do the work of HUD, you are including sexual orientation and gender identity. And I can tell you that HUD has made this a top priority since that Warden memo came out. The last couple of years, as far as FIP NOFOs that came out from HUD, grant proposals, a lot of emphasis was placed on the SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity. What are you going to do to promote this? If you are going to be a grantee of HUD, how are you going to promote and enforce sexual orientation, gender identity-based discrimination? So it's not just that the Supreme Court case passed and then they implement it into the laws. They have emphasized that this is a big deal and they want to hear from community programs such as ours. How are you doing this and what is the impact you're having? So understanding the enforcement. This is important to understand. The law did not change. The enforcement did, okay? Congress did not go back and rewrite the Fair Housing Act. They didn't make an addendum to it. They did not make any amendments or anything like that. Over the course of the last 55, 56 years, the Fair Housing Act has grown. It only started with, I believe, 3 or 4 protections: race, color, religion, national origin. In the 70s, they added gender. In the late 80s, they added disability. Eventually, families with children came along. Like, it kept growing and being amended. The Fair Housing Act was not amended in 2021. The enforcement of it simply changed by virtue of a Supreme Court ruling and the executive branch administration's decision to say, we will be enforcing this as tasked as the executive branch, the enforcer of laws. So the Fair Housing Act does not explicitly enumerate this language of the law, which again goes back to the idea that existing state and local laws and ordinances might have old language. Yeah, the Florida Fair Housing Act did not change. In fact, throughout Florida, I believe there's only 4 or 5 counties that have sexual orientation and gender identity-based discrimination protections written into their local fair housing ordinances. Alachua, Orange County, I believe Miami-Dade. I'm going to forget a few. Some cities, or the city of Orlando, city of Gainesville, stuff like that. So it is written into some of the local ordinances, but it does apply nationwide, statewide, because at the federal level, that's how it's being enforced. Okay. So the impact since the Bostock case, I checked recently. Sex-based complaints are on the rise. In 2022, that's the most updated numbers we have. I believe 2023 numbers come out this summer. 2,490 complaints were filed in 2022. This is up 10.1% from 2021. Now, we don't know for sure how many of those are sexual orientation and gender identity based, but the fact that the enforcement opened its arms to include additional folks in the community, and the number of complaints went up 10% year to year, we can probably guess that for the first time ever, because they're accepting these complaints, that had to have contributed to the sharp increase. This is the highest number recorded for sex-based complaints since 2005, when tracking began. And then also in the reporting, NFHA, NAFA requested information surveys, and HUD, all the data collected together, asked local organizations, for those of you who do enforce other protected classes at the state and local level in private reporting in 2022, how many of those were sexual orientation, gender identity? And those numbers were 240 sexual orientation, 210 gender identity in 2022, also numbers that are being increased. So we can see now that it is an available complaint to make. People are making it. However, I can tell you right now, those numbers should be higher. They should be absolutely higher. I know for a fact that there's a lot more than 2,490 incidences of sexual orientation and gender identity-based discrimination in housing occurring throughout the country. Why is that number, in my argument, so low? It's because it's a new law. It's a new offering of enforcement, and it takes a lot of people to get the information out there. Think of this. If you are a tenant and you are receiving discrimination and you don't know your rights, and you go to the internet and you Google search, what are my rights? If you don't land on all this information we just got done discussing, you're going to think that it's not protected. Because like we said, 29 states, the vast majority of counties, still do not have it written in their laws that sexual orientation and gender identity is protected. So if you don't know concepts like federalism, you don't understand the idea of how an executive branch and agencies will enforce laws at the local level through HUD funding, FAPs and FIPS, you are going to, at 2 in the morning, get frustrated and say, I guess I'm not protected, and close your laptop and go back to bed. So it's tasked with ourselves and other organizations, advocate groups, attorneys, to not only understand the law, but to help other people understand. This includes new home buyers, tenants, housing providers, lenders, legal aid community, county commissioners. That's a big one. Local county officials don't know that even though their own personal law doesn't enforce it, the federal law does. So the more people that can understand that this protection exists, my guess is that that number will go up even higher as far as the number of complaints that are being filed year to year. It's really going to take a lot of education and outreach to help with this. And then the last kind of little note I have here is, can it change back? Well, technically, we have a Supreme Court case in an employment-based ruling that now has over 1,000 citations to it, which will include things like housing, education, and so on and so forth. So we have strong case precedents that this is now the law of the land. But remember, the law itself did not change. In fact, in the dissenting opinion of Bostock, the dissent was very clear that you cannot read into the law what it does not say. Okay, plain language of the law doesn't say this, therefore you can't have it. Well, with the 6-3 majority of Bostock, those are good numbers. But as we all know, overturning precedent is not something the current court is, worried about doing. Okay, so if a new administration takes over, that new administration could come out with a different executive order that says we're not going to enforce LGBTQ protections under the Fair Housing Act. Even though we have the Supreme Court case that says basic legal reasoning says that you have this right, That doesn't mean we have to enforce it, okay? Or maybe we'll enforce it, but we're not going to actively enforce it. We're not going to affirmatively enforce it. You can still file these complaints, but maybe we don't do anything about it. So by not rewriting the law, you're really putting the protections into the hands of the current sitting administration. While the case precedent is strong, we really are dependent on the enforcement of it. This was a much faster conversation, but I would love to hear what questions you all might have. You can chat or raise your hand and let Alexis know that you might have a question, or maybe you have a comment. Maybe you have a story of your own where this has come up. We'd love, we have time for some discussion, so please jump in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joe and Pia. Folks, those of you who are here in the audience, take your time, think about any comments or any stories or anything that you want to share. If you would like to pose your question verbally, please raise your hand. I'll be able to see that in the participant list, and I will be able to take you off of mute. I know sometimes these things are harder to type out, rather than talking about verbally or out loud. So someone did say into the chat, great job, very thorough and helpful. I say this to say, they also said activism seems to be a key.
Yeah, I'm finding anytime you do community outreach work, the first thing you hear is, we didn't know that. Or how would I have known that? That's one of the biggest concerns, is how you get the message out is extremely important, and who you're getting it out to and everything like that. So activism is an extremely important part of this. It's a snowball effect, though. The more we can get this information into other people's hands and get it into people's homes, the more commonplace understanding we have of laws like this. So yeah, it's a great comment, definitely.
Awesome. And folks, while I'm typing the CLE code into the chat, please feel free to come forward with additional comments or questions. What I have here is the CLE code is 2404533N as in Nancy. Make sure I did that right. 2404533N as in Nancy. I'm going to pop that in. That is one general CLE credit. Right, one general CLE credit. So I think that, this is an extremely important conversation, and I appreciate you, Joe and Pia, for bringing it to us on this platform. I will, while we're still giving some folks some time to figure out other questions that they may have, I am going to take a quick look at our schedule of what we have coming up. I believe next session is our last session in our boot camp, right? Or no, one more. Oh, I like being wrong.
Yeah, so next week we'll be covering domestic violence and VAWA protections and how it overlaps with fair housing. And then our last session will be families with children, which I'm excited about because this is an often overlooked protected class. And every year to year, families with children is the least complained about as far as filing complaints. But in our world, it's, I think, the third most phone calls we get. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that too. Something that is not trained on enough or discussed enough. Also, shifting gears from the conversation of housing to just Pride in general. June does mark Pride Month, and I do want to say that I am, in the process of working on an additional training, on other Pride-related issues that should be coming your way in June. So folks who have signed up because of that topic in particular, not necessarily the housing aspect, there should be more coming your way. I did just pop into the chat what we have coming up. I know Joe just said it, but to be specific, the dates and the times. And as I remind everybody, if you were registered for this or any of the previous events, you will automatically be registered for the following events. So don't worry, you'll receive information and notification of those events coming up next week and the week after. So with no, go ahead.
I was going to note real quick, I saw an earlier chat, Paul gave us kind of a update on some casework he's been doing, and it looks like some of our conversations in the past weeks about ESAs might have helped out. So thank you for passing that along. That's awesome. That's so cool. Thank you.
That's awesome. Awesome to see that the impact is being made and being felt. But of course, I say this every time, learning from you, Joe and Pia, is easy. You make it really,
Mhm.
really digestible, really easy, and super empowering, in my opinion. All right, folks. Well, no need to keep you on longer. I know it's Tuesday. We all have many things that we need to do. Certainly, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. You have, Joe, is your email up there? No, that's the Fair Housing. Yeah,
That does go to me though. So yeah, that is my email.
perfect. So folks, jot that down. You can reach out to Joe and Pia that way. I also did drop my email address into the chat earlier. You need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Before we sign off, I know you've done enough talking. Any last minute things you'd like to share?
No, just hope to see you guys again for the next 2 weeks. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Pia, were you going to say something? No? All right. Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Joe and Pia. We will see you all next Tuesday. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right. Thank you. You guys take care.